You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Broward MPO Executive Director Greg Stuart to talk about the history of Broward County, its connections to the rest of South Florida, the historic MAPS transportation plan, and how they're dealing with potential sea level rise and impacts of the pandemic. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues or more information about the annual conference live in Miami, go to railvolution.org. That's railvolution.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Heavy knit bus or bike only, or lightweight bike only with fading checkerboard design. Sign up at patreon.com/theoverheadwire and I'll send one right along. You can also purchase the scarves at theoverheadwire.com. Get your fresh Elmo or fresh Kermit before winter arrives. Order now at theoverheadwire.com. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Greg Stuart, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me here today.
Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I work for the Broward Metropolitan Planning Organization. We have about 38 board members and a staff of 42. We process about $1.5 billion a year in federal transportation dollars into Broward County, which is part of South Florida. We're the 6th largest metropolitan area in the country, and that's including Miami-Dade and Palm Beach. And we have an incredible amount of traffic and congestion down here, and very high cost of living. So a lot of the transportation things interweave with my own experiences. Prior to coming to the Broward MPO, I was the planning and zoning director for Broward County government, the unincorporated area, which at the time had about 850,000 people. Before joining them, I was with the city of West Palm Beach, and I was the planning, zoning, and building director there under the first strong mayor. Her name was Nancy Graham, and we built some of the first new urbanist downtown developments, including a thing called City Place. I'm responsible for lobbying for about, back then in the 90s, for about $36 million federal earmark for transportation that we got out of Congress to do a bunch of traffic calming and bike lanes and just, improvement in a city that had been forlorn for car traffic only. Prior to that, I was with the Florida Department of Community Affairs, which was the growth management agency of the state of Florida, and was one of only 2 states in the country that had statewide land use and zoning, where we were really working towards trying to create urban service boundaries and keep the urban areas contained and be able to manage growth in water and sewer capacity, working on school capacities and parks. So really interesting kind of background there, which all started with my first job out of college, which was a small county in northwest Florida called Citrus County along the coast. And they had 98,000 people. And it was like, okay, well, this is an interesting challenge. Wrote their first comprehensive plan and their first unified planning document, which was zoning. They didn't have zoning when I first got there, so I had a lot of interesting conversations with pig farmers. Believe it or not.
Are there pig farming zones?
Yeah, well, now there is. Back then there was no zoning, so you'd have residential single-family developments coming in adjacent to pig farms. And I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to tour a pig farm, but the pits that the pigs enjoy bathing in have a unique smell, and so they don't necessarily make the best compatible neighbor.
I will say I've been to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Tyson Chicken is right there, so maybe it's similar.
Probably a chicken. We didn't have chicken farms there. I had seen them in Georgia back when I was an undergrad, and I remember going, "Wow, this really does smell." There's no way around it. Anyway, so basically, my experiences come from basically entry level all the way up to senior management, working on everything from land use and transportation, trying to kind of change the way we do business. Working at the Department of Community Affairs, I worked with a gentleman named Ben Starrett, and we actually created transportation concurrency exception areas, which really was all about trying to encourage transit and the use of transit in urbanized areas, moving away from a livable service standard for cars. And that then got me very interested in the whole idea of livable cities and what that would look like. And I had the great opportunity to go to West Palm Beach and really practice that. Their zoning code, their land use, and all the rest of it. Dwani Platters-Libert had come in and done a couple master plans for us. And so we had to take their master plans and make them into zoning documents, which that was kind of an interesting experience. And then ultimately, coming down here to Broward County, which I think is, one of the most unique things that I've experienced. We're a built out community with about 2 million people in the county boundaries, and watching it change from what was a rural area to a suburban area. And the term Browardization was used a lot in suburban type development. And now we're turning around and becoming a very neighborhood centric community where the neighborhoods of these cities are becoming unique beasts of themselves. But so, the bigger picture with Broward is, what it's becoming and the changes that are happening. And, even from my own neighborhood, I literally on the weekends, I don't need to use my car. We walk to the grocery store, we walk to restaurants, we're able to ride our bikes. And that's happening throughout Southeast Florida, that experience. So even though the density is increasing, the distance of vehicle travel is actually decreasing. So it's an interesting experience on that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Also, is it normal for planning and zoning directors and folks that focus on comprehensive plans and things like that to go to an MPO?
No. From my experience, no, it really isn't. And that was actually when I got offered the job, that was one of the interesting things, with the elected officials on my board. They're like, finally, we have somebody that understands land use. And it was eye-opening when I went and met with a bunch of my colleagues, because many of them really, they don't come from that background. They come from a transportation engineering, roadway capacity, Department of Transportation type background, and they don't necessarily, and that's not a bad thing. It's just, I have a different view of the system. And that view, I've been really almost evangelistic in working with my colleagues through the American Metropolitan Planning, or the Association of MPOs, and the National Association of Regional Councils. When I get a chance to talk to them, I'm not just talking to them about the transportation component. It's how it integrates with all the other aspects. So I think probably it was a good thing that I got the job and I got the experience. But what taught me the experience, kind of neat story, is when I was in West Palm Beach, we actually were working very hard to get the earmark out of Congress back when earmarks were allowed. Chair of Appropriations on the House side was a gentleman named Mark Foley. And we worked hard with him to get the appropriation. The appropriation was issued, and the budget was passed in Washington, and they gavelled it. My mayor and I are very excited. This is great. We're going to get $36 million, a lot of money back in the 90s. And we're like, okay, well, where's the money? And I'm like, where's it coming from? So they said, well, it was transferred over to Florida Department of Transportation. So called FDOT and central office. I'm like, hey, the mayor and I were waiting for the money, got all these programs. And they're like, well, Greg, you have to work with this thing called an MPO. And I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be interesting. What's an MPO? And they're like, well, Palm Beach County has an MPO. So who was in charge? Randy Whitfield was the gentleman's name. Nice guy. He taught me a lot. So when I ended up calling Randy, and the county and the city didn't necessarily get along very well. The county wanted more suburbanization or Browardization, as some people would call it, with Walgreens on every corner. Yeah, I'm like, well, time to get the money. And he goes, well, Greg, and he has a southern accent, so I apologize in advance. I'm going to do a little bit of a drawl. But it'd be, well, Greg, you need to go and amend this thing called long range transportation plan. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll figure that out. So looked into what an LRTP is, and I'm like writing the amendment, working with my team members. We submitted it, went at public hearings, they advertised it, and I'm like, done. Great. Where's my money? Well, Greg, there's this thing called the Transportation Improvement Plan. And I'm like, what? And he goes, yeah, we got to put you in that. And that usually is in the 5th year of the transportation plan. So basically, you'll get your money in about 6 years from now.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. So all the good plans that we had to complete the city's entire rebuild the infrastructure in the city of West Palm Beach, all the roadways, one passed my mayor's, past her term. Basically she was term limited out. And then the subsequent mayor didn't ever get to get the money. And so then the mayor after that, who is now a congresswoman in Washington from the West Palm Beach area, basically had the chance to put the money in the investment where we had thought it was supposed to go. Unfortunately for her, the project had to be built all within that physical time period, all after the year of expenditure, the 5th year or 6th year from when we originally finally got it approved through the local government process. So basically, she had to build all the transportation projects within basically a year and a half. And that created complete gridlock in West Palm Beach, created all these horrible experiences for her as a mayor. And it really wasn't the intent. We had really planned to do, here we'll phase this project in, phase that project, build everything out over a time period. And unfortunately, because the money would expire because it was an earmark, the way it had run through the process that Randy told me I needed to do, Randy Whitfield, the mayor had that mayor had a lot to face. That said, I learned the entire MPO process from Randy.
Well, good thing you know it now, right?
Well, it was interesting. When I ended up with this job almost 15 years later, I called Randy. Randy was still in the position. And I called him and I'm like, hey, Randy, remember me? And he goes, yeah. And I'm like, guess where I work? And he's like, what? So it was like one of those moments where it's like, now you understand the roles, you understand what you're supposed to do, because of him, that it's like now I can actually really work with the local governments to get things done.
Yeah.
Because the other thing, well, the processes are all the same. There are ways to expedite, like doing a long-range transportation plan amendment along with the TIP amendment should have happened simultaneously. They shouldn't have been staggered. And so I've been able to work with my locals to make sure that they get projects through and out the system. We had a streetcar, basically, that we were going to put in here in South Florida in Broward with an appropriation of about $136 million. And I fast-tracked that as fast as I could possibly get it through, working with the FTA on that. Unfortunately, things take time, and the politicians changed, and the public decided that the streetcar would sink into the ground because there wasn't, the ground is soft. And I'm like, okay, interesting theory. So now we're, past that point, and they're now talking about a light rail system, a heavier rail system. We're looking at doing bus-only lanes. We're actually, the system plan in my background is actually where we are.
I want to know. First off, a little bit more about Broward County. I mean, you talk about Browardization and kind of some of that history, but I'm curious. Like, it's part of 3 MPOs in South Florida, and that's interesting to me, just because I don't think there's any other place in the country that has 3 large MPOs right next to each other. But also, kind of, what's some background about Broward that might be interesting to the listeners?
Broward, basically, the Broward has grown rapidly. It really is one of those places. It started in the 80s with a decent population of about 600,000 people, and it grew to 2 million where we are today. And that growth really is kind of what makes it a little bit more unique. The experiences of the area it's a suburban area to Miami-Dade. because it's not. It actually had its own UZA urbanized area. Palm Beach had its own urbanized area, and Miami-Dade had its own. And as a child, I remember there used to be trees between Broward and Miami-Dade and Broward and Palm Beach. And in fact, there were trees in lots of areas. But when you're talking about back then, there were really basically three large cities here, larger, like close to 80,000. And it was Pompano, Fort Lauderdale, and Hollywood. And then a couple of smaller cities, Dayton Beach, Hallandale Beach, and so forth. And everything started growing together during the 80s. And that's when we probably had the fastest growth rate in the nation. And we started seeing growth in areas that didn't necessarily support the growth initially. One of the things that Broward actually had done that I had in my pocket was in 72, the precursor to the MPO. It was called the Broward County Land Use Planning Board. They actually created a master plan for the county, which basically had a build out of about 2.4 million. And they had two different models of growth the county could have. And one was a suburban model, which is the one they chose. And one was an urbanized model, which we can still do. And so it laid everything out. It said, they build here, do this, do that. It actually laid out a transit system. It laid out a roadway network, a highway system. It laid out where schools could go, where you'd have business centers. And to be really honest with you, it grew that way, even through the 80s and 90s with the rapid growth. And that document itself, they weren't using. So the natural growth actually mimicked what this organization had put together. It also had laid out a governance structure that they didn't follow. They had a regional governance structure, and they were like, there should only be 5 governments, and there's 31 cities here now, plus the county. So it didn't necessarily, you can tell no one followed this document, but naturally it grew that way. There was an expressway that ran through the center of the county to a beltway that ran around the edges of the county towards the Everglades. And the Sawgrass Expressway, pretty much it's where they had projected it was going to be. The East-West Expressway, they had called the Port Everglades Expressway. That's actually now 595. So, a lot of that actually occurred, laid out where greenways would occur. And lo and behold, a lot of plans that I had seen before I got here talked about this greenway and that greenway. So a lot of the work from the early 70s was translatable into not only the development pattern that occurred here, but then the next development pattern, which is this redevelopment that we are going through. And I think that's kind of the fascinating part. And that redevelopment is also occurring where they projected urban centers. And so following that map, the 72 document, which was a simple, very small, maybe 60 pages program of what a development pattern could look like, we've been following. And that's actually been part and parcel of what we did in our long-range transportation plans to say, okay, well, now we know this has happened, and utilizing the book from 72 and where redevelopment is actually occurring, which was based on what the 72 plan said, then this is the type of transit system that could go into effect. And this is what it can support. And so that next generation of development that we're having now to bring us up to what our maximum level of support can be based on resources at about 2.4, 2.5 million people, we know that, we're the system and what that system could look like. And our partners at the County Transit Office and at Tri-Rail and at Florida Department of Transportation, I've been introducing them to this document when I got this job because I just happen to have a copy of it. God knows how I got it, but we'll have that discussion one day. And I literally kept on following it and just as a guide, and I've been sharing it with our local government partners as well. So they're aware of why their corridors look the way the corridors do and what they can do to the corridors. And, we helped create land use categories that would advance a transit system. So while it doesn't, like James, one of my favorite lines that he uses is OD without the T. And it's like, so we have all this area where you have oriented development, but we didn't necessarily have the right transit in place. But That's not because we weren't trying. It was because there was actually a plan that once that development got in place, it would support the infrastructure for a transit system. That's been one of the efforts that our MPO has been, basically grappling with when I first got here, and now very direct. This is what we're doing, and this is how we're doing it. And that's affected affordable housing. It's affected climate change as well, because we know from soils and all the rest of it from that 72 plan what type of storm surge this area can handle, what type of drainage, natural drainage that can occur based on heavy flooding and heavy rain events. So now all of a sudden you start seeing those aspects of the 72 plan come into our reality now. And it's a very kind of neat thing to know that there was a group of people back in the 70s that were actually thinking about this stuff and that their ideas weren't lost.
Also, I mean, going back even further than 72, there's a history of development on like the FEC corridor, right? The Flagler line. There's a history of cities popping up along the rail line, and kind of that being a way for the coastal Florida to develop. And I'm wondering how much the 72 plan kind of reflects some of that initial development that happened originally because of the rail line.
Well, the rail line's fascinating all in of itself, because basically there were a few cities down here, Dania Beach, or Dania it was called, and Fort Lauderdale. There was another little city here called Florinanda that became what a city called Oakland Park now in Broward. And the rail line itself that the Henry Flagler brought down from St. Augustine, because they had a freeze up there and he was looking for areas for his resort hotels. And so Broward wasn't like the stop on the railroad that he was interested in for the redevelopment side or the development side. It really was Fort Dallas, which became Miami, and Palm Beach Island, which we know where West Palm is. So that was part and parcel of his designs. So Broward didn't necessarily have that design. It was actually an area that they were kind of skipping over. It was more agricultural, and they had planned it to be agricultural, even on the Florida East Coast. There was a couple of stations, but it was to pick up and deliver farm product versus what happened in Miami or Fort Dallas and in Palm Beach Island, where it was more of here's where you drop off tourists and where we're encouraging development. So Broward didn't necessarily have that history with the Florida East Coast Railway like the other two arid parts of the region have. It was always looked at more as a farmer community. And so, with that type of knowledge, the FEC development itself back in the 20s and 10s and late 1800s, basically all of that really wasn't what the rail line did for Broward. It wasn't. It was, again, the ag side of things. The military ended up putting in a Army Air Force base where for training for pilots. But even then, for the most part, Broward was pretty rural and pretty agricultural. So, that the effect now with the FEC is a little bit different of a story. And we can tell that by, the Bright Line and our future commuter rail system, at least from downtown Miami up to West Palm Beach or up to downtown Fort Lauderdale. The first phase of local passenger rail back on that corridor is going to be a lot of redevelopment at that point, where the stations are going to come back in. And I think that's the story, the lore you're trying to spin into this. But the reality of that is these were agricultural areas. And there was really no like this, we're going to become the big cities along the corridor. Hollywood Beach, city of Hollywood, had a station, and there was a resort hotel from the 20s. But even with that, it didn't catch like the Biltmore in Miami and what became Miami-Dade County, or West Palm and Palm Beach. Even Boca Raton struggled for years because it was more agricultural. So, the story originally of the rail line for those cities, that was what brought a lot more people down here, but it wasn't necessarily what built the cities. Once that was there, the roadway network came in and all the rest of it, and real estate developers started looking everywhere, and lots of subdivided land started happening, where people in Chicago and New York could put $500 down or $500 in and own a piece of property in South Florida. A majority of that was in areas that were not suitable to build houses. There was just not even land there.
Hmm.
So, a lot of speculation occurred. And maybe that's what the story of the rail line was it brought the speculation to this region, but the development itself that occurred, post World War II. And that was probably, you look at the advent of the automobile, the Florida Turnpike, the movie theater, where the boys are, kind of changed people's views of what Broward County was and what it could be.
But now you have an opportunity because there is that rail line there, and it does connect to all these places along the corridor.
Brightline coming in, the private rail system, that's phenomenal. That's a great system that is ultimately, the design was originally to bring it to Orlando, and that's still moving forward. The Flagler rail line, the passenger rail that used to be there, that's coming back with this, coastal rail system we're putting in. We have a second heavy rail system to the west here where my offices are out the window. We're on top of the Cypress Creek station. That connects all the western cities together, or west eastern cities together on that line. And, basically now it's a matter of tying the rest of the systems together. But I'm going to go back. The roadway network really kind of is what drove and I hate to use the term traffic, to the region. And, the train sells a good story, but it was the genesis of very small towns and not of what became a megalopolis. And now I think the megalopolis, the story of that is the fascinating piece of rebuilding the infrastructure to actually handle it. And that's, as I opened up the statement, a lot of the cities here where the neighborhoods are becoming unique to themselves and self-sustaining and self-contained. And I think that's the thing that then allows for a transit system to make a difference. Your BART system and your streetcar system where you live, phenomenal, great stuff. Where I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we had a trolley system that would go from one borough to another borough and around. But that's how those places grew. This didn't necessarily grow that way. It's that long linear piece. Mm-hmm. And you can say, yeah, but it didn't necessarily promote an ecosystem.
And now you have, just a couple of weeks ago, I got emails from your team about what's going on in Broward County, including Map Broward. I'm curious a little bit more about the Mobility Advancement Program and kind of how you are trying to implement that.
Basically, the Mobility Advancement Program is the implementation of a penny surtax down here for transportation. Our agency basically got really tired of every time we would look at this map behind me again, our transit systems plan and say, hey, you could do this. We could do buses and exclusive lanes. We could put a light rail system down. We could do a streetcar system. And it would always be, we don't have the money. We don't have the money. We don't have the money. So my board basically directed me and go figure out how to get the money. And there's only so much money you can get out of Washington, but we need to have a local pot. And so we spent a good 7 years through a program called Speak Up Broward. And we would go out to communities and talk the importance of transportation and ways to fund a system, ways to pay for a light rail system, ways to pay for a heavy rail system. And it always came back to, well, you have the ability to tax rental cars and you can tax license tags. But what really generates the money is sales tax, because it not only taxes the people that are here, but we have a very robust tourist trade. Not like Disney, but still robust enough. And we actually have probably one of the largest mega yacht sales every year in the world, where people come here and buy these yachts that are $350 million and more, and they all get a percentage tax on them. It's all great. So, yeah, it's a world I don't understand, but it's all good.
I always challenge understand that world.
Yeah, I always when people call me to complain, I'm like, listen, give me a chance. Let me go with you so I understand the suffering you're going through. But, the bigger picture, that's a story about Brightline. I'll tell you that later. But that's kind of where the sales tax settled. And so, talking to the public, the private sector before I got here went out for a surtax for a really robust transit system. It failed. We worked with the cities and the county for a 50-50, a half penny for transit and a half penny for infrastructure. They unfortunately they tied it together, but and ballot language was awful. But the penny for transportation passed, and the penny for infrastructure failed. The reason we had divided it up in that way is because the cities needed to redo their roads and all the rest of it, the necessary parts to support a bus rapid transit system, the things that you need to have in place. So that was failed, and it was tied together. Both things had to pass for it to pass. The ballot language was for the transit was do you, yes or no, and do you agree to raise by 1 cent, or half a cent. And then the other language for infrastructure said, do you support increasing your tax by 0.05% for sales tax for infrastructure? And then it wasn't a yes or no, it was all in the yes or no box. And it failed, obviously. Our focus groups that we did afterwards, actually, the voters said, well, I voted no for that because I thought you were raising our sales tax by 5 cents because of the way it was written.
Mm.
And it was really kind of interesting because it was 0.05 cent. And, if you it took me a while to understand that. But then I'm like, oh, yeah, I could see why that would confuse somebody. So then the third time we went out, which was the charm, with the county, it was for a full penny for transportation, period, which is what established the MAP program. And that actually passed in almost a supermajority. There, we said that there was going to be about 27 miles of light rail, but didn't identify where. We had identified a whole bunch of projects, but didn't say which and when. And it was a really interesting thing to see pass because it was completely counterintuitive to what everybody tells you on how a surtax should work. And I met with my colleagues from around the country when we were moving forward with that, and I'm like, it's really hard to say this to people because we're always so busy going around going, you have to show exactly where that station is going to be and what that system is going to look like and where the start and stop and the points and this and the other. And basically, the voters in Broward said, no, I don't care. Take this money and do something with it. And that's what created the MAP program, which is, to be honest with you, probably one of the greatest achievements I can say that's happened down here in probably a good 20 to 30 years, because that actually has opened up our communities not only to be able to self-fund projects, but also leverage a lot of this infrastructure tax that's coming out of Washington, thankfully, to actually advance a bunch of transit projects. And so the map behind me may not exactly be the exact map that they're going to build, but it stimulated the conversation in the community enough to say, yeah, we want something and I don't care. Get it done. And so, we were excited to see that pass, obviously. The county was extremely excited. The money actually sits with the county commission, the way Florida law is written. So it's been a real positive thing. Our partners in Hillsborough County in Tampa Bay area, they also had a half penny sales tax that they did, but it ended up being deemed unconstitutional because they were putting the money instead of with the Hillsborough County folks, that they were putting money in different agencies' pots and different cities' pots, and so the state Supreme Court called that unconstitutional. So basically, the way we've done it here in Broward now, the way it's written and passed, that leaves it to be constitutional. It really is the county commissioner's money and their decision point. So, for us working with the county administrator, Monica Sapiro, who I would have loved to, I wanted her to be on with me today. We're working together to try to figure out things to get built and what moves forward. So the Broward County part of the Coastal Link project, or in Miami-Dade, they call it their SMART plan, the Northeast Corridor, we're ready to rock and roll with that. We have the CapEx money put together. There's the operating money already put together. So we're able to go and we're going to actually be putting that into small starts literally, hopefully in September, to move forward with that corridor.
Yeah. So how does that link up to the money from the infrastructure bill, like you mentioned? I mean, there's a lot of money in there, increase in funding for transportation projects. Obviously, it's a good amount of money, but it's not it's not a ridiculous amount of money. It's still you still have to go through, like you said, small starts and the I guess I don't know what they're calling it these days, but new starts to get the larger projects. But yeah, it seems like a good thing. But how is that working out for you all in terms of trying to apply for the programs, or have you even started yet? Because it's just so new.
It's so new, and we are going. Like I said, we're going through the small starts for this corridor. September would be the first thing. There's actually two projects the county wants to move forward with without federal funding, just using our local funds. That would be more of an east-west project, and I'm not necessarily at liberty to tell you which ones they are, but I can tell you that those are also going to be moving forward at the same time we're doing this north-south piece. And we're also going to be submitting next year for intermodal pieces that connect the seaport, airport, tri-rail, FEC, Brightline, and local passenger all together. And that's because we have the leverage of the local money, the MAP money. That's going to allow us to go after a larger share of the discretionary. So while small starts, new starts, the pots grew, but they're still the same pots. There's also all the discretionary grant programs. And so what I've been working together with our partners at the county and the cities is let's find one mega project. And that's that intermodal center I'm talking about, connecting airport, seaport to all the local services. And that might be our mega project. The mayor of Fort Lauderdale wants to create a tunnel system for the railroad through downtown to allow for additional, and yes, you can build tunnels in South Florida, and they don't flood. You can actually do that. And he's advocating for that for the purposes of additional residential units and all the rest, which actually allows us. The reason housing is so expensive here is just there's a lack of development space. San Francisco is similar. You lead us in that, but we're not that far behind.
Yeah.
That said, so there's a lot of trying to coalesce around certain projects is going to be the interesting challenge for us. But the money is there and the match is there. We can do 50% matches, 75% matches to federal. And that's an unusual situation for almost anybody. Even my partners down in Miami-Dade, right now they're sitting with a half penny. They really, if they had a full penny, you'd see a much more robust system being developed in Miami-Dade. And my partners to the north in Palm Beach, they haven't even started the conversation yet. So, I'm happy to have those conversations with them of what they could do to kind of move forward.
Well, it's not just transit projects too. You have transportation projects kind of writ large. There's bike ped improvements. There's bus stop and shelter improvements. You have the high capacity corridor planning. What other projects are in the hopper, as it were, and which projects stand out to you most?
Actually, that's been fun too, because knowing that, when we first, like I said, when I got here, I'm like, let's do these transit projects. And they're like, well, we don't have any money. I did have the federal money or formula dollars that were coming down to us. And so working with my board, we were like, okay, we studied the corridors. We knew where the transit was going to be. And that also came out of that 72 plan. And we recognized that the transit wasn't there yet. So James and my entire mobility team started focusing on last mile connections on these corridors. So the bike lanes and the sidewalks and all the infrastructure that you normally would see cities build after the transit system went in, we've put in before. So, just in my tenure here, I've been shy of about $750 million worth of just sidewalk projects. And I still have more to go. And all of that was because we were tying neighborhoods to corridors. We were putting in sidewalks in the neighborhood so that way you could walk from your house to the corridor to get on a rapid bus or a light rail system because we know it's going to be there. And so we were really focusing on those last mile connections over the last decade to spend our federal dollars putting that infrastructure in. That's why now with the MAP program to help them focus on a transit system is like great for us because we can kind of show them through this dense neighborhood we've already done the last mile connections, and now these folks that live a quarter mile in, a half mile in, have a safe walking route to get to transit. And on top of that, we've been working with the cities to plant trees and create the environment where you can actually walk there because, yeah, it gets hot here. So we get into the 90s, feel like temperatures can be about 100, but we have an ocean breeze. And with shade and an ocean breeze, it's actually quite nice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's walkable. So we've been really concentrating on that. The bike lanes that we've been putting in, which has been a whole nother thing, I'm really proud of personally. A lot of people don't understand it, but I would go to meetings and people would show up and, their child had died, been run over by a car because they were on their bike, or their husband was run over by a car because he got off of a bus and needed to cross the street in a location and the infrastructure wasn't there. He went through Vietnam, but it didn't make it off a bus in Broward. So I've been really advocating the infrastructure necessary to create a safer environment for folks too. And so we've added hundreds of miles of bike lanes to our communities. And there's one particular area that I'm extremely proud of, which there were three children that unfortunately died, not together, but at separate incidents over a multiple year period. And now that neighborhood, we rebuilt the road, 2-lane facility, put in bike lanes, put in sidewalks, put in pedestrian scale lighting. And you can go there at any time of day or night, and there are people on bikes, and there are people walking their dogs, and there are people, feeding the ducks. And I kind of look at that and go, if you have like one of those moments in time where you said, "Yeah, I did a good thing," that's when you realize, yeah, you actually kind of did a good thing. And there hasn't been a pedestrian or bicyclist fatality within that part of the region, and since those improvements occurred. So, I mean, there's things that we've been doing to be proactive. There's things that we've been doing to be reactive. I don't think in my lifetime we're going to get to a vision zero where we don't have any fatalities here. But that is a personal goal because no one should die trying to get to the doctors or trying to get to your job or even just going for a walk with your kids. And trying to create the environment for that is really important and important to our organization.
Let's talk a little bit about climate change and potential sea level rise. I think that Florida has a little bit of, there's obviously you're on the coastline, and so you see it already. And I'm wondering what the MPO's kind of role is in, adaptation or process to make sure that there's places that are safe from climate change, and you're dealing with the kind of the fallout from what potentially could happen in the future.
That's a really great question, and I'm going to give you a longer-winded probably answer. So we actually had experienced during Hurricane Sandy, which was 500 miles off our coast. It removed our coastal highway, Route A1A it's called, actually took out the bedrock of the road, and the road collapsed into the ocean. It happened on a beautiful, clear day while Hurricane Sandy was off the coast, but it was a gorgeous day. It was a Sunday. I was at my house, and the city manager of Fort Lauderdale at the time called me and said, "Do you have the DOT secretary's cell phone number?" And I'm like, "Why?" And, legitimate question Sunday, "Why are you calling me for this?" and it's beautiful out. And he goes, "A1A has gone into the ocean." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, this between here and here." And I'm like, first I'm thinking, okay, beautiful day. It hasn't rained. I was at the beach earlier in the morning. Everything was fine. So I got on my bike and I actually rode to the one bike lanes that we put in. I rode down to where he was talking about. And lo and behold, the road had actually washed out. And ocean water was coming over and palm trees had collapsed into the road. And the lifeguard stands were tipped over. And I'm like, what the hell? And literally, I called the city manager, Lee Feldman, at the time, and I'm like, here's the number for Jim Wolf. I'm also calling him to let him know to get his people out here because it's actually a state road. And it was like, it became an emergency for all of us. It wasn't a declared emergency at the state level. So it was a little difficult to deal with because, there was a little bit of denying going on up in Tallahassee at the time. And we're not exactly one of their favorite places. And, we basically all got together, all the agencies, and said, okay, we need to get funding in here. and deal with rebuilding the roadway. We had the discussion of what that would be like, and is it important enough to keep the connection there? The state district secretary came up with you drive pilings down to keep the bedrock in, the road in, and you do this and you do that, and the road can be re-inundated by the ocean water a few times, but it wouldn't be pulled out to sea. So we started really thinking about what resilient infrastructure would look like. And the Obama administration, we applied for a grant with the Obama administration to actually study not just Broward, but Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Monroe. And we looked at all of the state and federal facilities here in Southeast Florida and looked with, there's a climate change compact people here. I'm sure they'll be at the event, but they have studies that they've been doing, but we actually did our own and measured which road would go underwater and when based on different scenario planning. We had a private consultant, my favorite name ever. His name was James Flood. And James came up with all these scenarios for us. And we've actually, on the Broward piece, we actually went a little bit further and we asked our board for additional money to do local roads. So we actually have an idea of when each road and when failure will occur, 500-year, 1,000-year storm events, all of that. And we started looking at that, and we actually calculate that in when we're providing funding to rebuild roads or put in improved facilities. And so we're already looking at ways to maintain and mitigate some of those impacts locally. Obviously, a 20-foot sea level rise, at that point, it's
Yeah.
toast is a little
Hard
bit.
to
That's a very different conversation.
hard to plan for that.
Well, I've been working with the development community, and they've actually been really kind of interesting to work with because we had the conversation about the first and second floors of some of these multifamily taller buildings, 30, 40, 50-story buildings. Can they be resilient enough to handle being inundated permanently on the first and second levels? And can the building continue to operate? Make sure that the generators and all the rest of it can be hooked up in a place that they stay above the 30-foot flood level and, the final inundation, as I'd call it, and see to keep things somewhat livable. We may reflect more of being like a Venice than we would be looking like Southeast Florida as it is today. But, a lot of the developers are very keen on saying, okay, well, they're looking at their properties more than a 30-year investment plan. It's a 50-year, 100-year. And so, we actually did a lot of work on our studies. James Grimmer, again, from my team, led a lot of those efforts. He's really, very, very good at understanding systems. And so we've been looking at the roadway network. I actually want to we've been working with Florida Power and Light on the power network. A lot of the rationale of not burying the electrical system is because of sea level rise. So we've actually been working with them. They've been raising the power grid, not lowering it. And so it, one, gets above the tree line, and two, it's actually more sustainable at that level. And it allows us to kind of deal with the necessary infrastructure that society is going to need to make it through, at least a percentage of us, maybe 30% of us might be left down here, to be able to proceed in an environment. So we look at that when we look at any of the investments we're doing with our federal dollars. And with the Biden administration now, they've actually allowed us to go further, which is allowing us to even look at affordable housing. So all those links kind of tie together: the sea level rise, the storm events, and now affordable housing. Because housing is, when you talk about losing, maybe 40% of your housing stock eventually, you need to be able to figure out where that 40% or at least 20% of it will go. They're not all going to move to Orlando.
Yeah. And then there's also, I'm going from doom to doom, but, climate change, and then also, the pandemic. I'm curious how that's impacted Broward County and your work at the MPO.
That one's a really good question as well, because, what we actually saw, which was kind of indication for our bike lane and sidewalks efforts, is people actually started using them much more. People were stuck at home. They wanted to use the facilities we built. And I got a lot of, you don't usually get thank you emails from people, but during the pandemic, a lot of the folks that I did get emails from we're like, I'm really glad the sidewalk's here now. I'm really glad there's this bike lane. I took my family on a bike ride. And because, you couldn't really didn't go to stores, you didn't go to restaurants, everything got delivered. So, the reality, the system itself wasn't as scary for people. That said, we didn't stop doing what we needed to do either. Well, our offices kind of morphed into everybody working from home like everybody else did. The reality was we just kept the system moving, and we made sure that our projects continued to move into the pipeline to get constructed. And we actually did a lot of work for roadway work, which, we did bike lanes in an area between Pompano and Lighthouse Point, northeast Broward. And the cities were like, oh no, this is going to be horrible. The pandemic happened, the bike lanes got put in, and no, there was no tragedy. The maintenance of traffic continued. All the stores that were there stayed there, and it was just like, okay, things actually, sometimes out of adversity, good things come. That adversity that everybody was facing, it was like all of a sudden people who always would say, no one's ever going to walk in Florida, in South Florida. It's just too hot. It's just too sunny. It's just too this, too that. And now all of a sudden people are walking. They're walking to grocery stores. It created an environment that people started thinking, well, where am I going to go? I mean, I'm just going to go for a quick walk. And all of a sudden that was an advantage thing to really redefining the way South Florida operates. Even folks that lived in more suburban areas and gated communities, I got calls too. It's like, I need sidewalks in my neighborhood. Well, you're in a gated community. I'm sorry, I can't put the investment there because it has to be open to the public. And it was kind of funny listening to folks that, had isolated themselves for, a good 2 decades, all of a sudden wanting to become part of a fabric of society. So, again, that's the planner in me. But it was interesting.
Well, so Railvolution will be coming to South Florida in October, actually October 30th to November 2nd. What do you hope that people will come see in Broward? I imagine that you all have a few mobile workshops and some stuff that's going on up there in Fort Lauderdale, et cetera. I'm curious what you hope folks will check out when they get there.
I hope that they get off the train in Fort Lauderdale, or if they take Tri-Rail in Hollywood and Pompano, and actually go to our neighborhoods. Don't spend time going to the second largest attraction in Florida, the Sawgrass Mills, which is a big giant shopping mall. I'm not saying don't go there, but I'm saying spend some time experiencing really the South Florida that most people don't see. Get off of the interstate highway system, get off of the arterial network, and go in and experience some of the neighborhood areas that actually have these small little local downtowns. Go to a restaurant. I'm gonna try, hopefully with my team members, to provide a list of places to go and experience what is unique about South Florida. Because what's ununique about South Florida, or the term again, I'm going to use Browardization, is the Walgreens on every corner, because that's happened in Miami, it happened here, it happened in Palm Beach. That's not what Florida's about. What Florida is that little neighborhood like I live in, where I walk 3 blocks and I'm at a brewery, and I walk another block and I can get my hair cut. I walk a half a block and I can go to my local grocer. That's the experience I really would like to see the folks from Railvolution have, because why people choose to stay like you have in San Francisco is that walkability and experience, and that it's a great place to be a person. And we have that here, but you don't see it when you're sitting in your car, and you don't see it when you're on 95, and you definitely don't see it when you land on your airplane, because all you see is lights sprawling in all directions. But if you have that chance to have the experience, that's really what I'm looking for. Go to downtown Hollywood, go to the Mass District, go to the Fat Village, go to downtown Pompano, spend some time along some of our coastal cities, Lauderdale by the Sea, Pompano Beach by the Sea, Dania Beach, and have a chance to actually see what like the new urban or re-urbanizing areas can bring value to. I think that there's a lot of really neat experiences for the folks to have and understand why we're still growing.
I look forward to seeing the map of where you tell people to go.
Yeah. Well, we kind of mimic this, because a lot of those circles, those are like places that are neat to go to.
Yeah.
And that's where you capture people's interest, because it's not a shopping center on an arterial. It's why. You can do that anywhere.
Yeah. Where can folks find more information about Broward and the Broward MPO?
Well, our website is a great place to start. It's browardmpo.org. We also have a Facebook and all the social media, which is captured under Speak Up Broward. And that will provide you lots of information and data. And we're really happy to, just if they want to ask a direct question, info@browardmpo.org. Personally will look at it and provide you comments back and provide information that you might be interested in.
Awesome. Well, Greg, I want to thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed. Thanks for letting me yammer on for a while.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.